They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش جيل ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي
عاش بنورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه. عاش بنورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح. عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح. عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И звон продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to The World Tonight, or perhaps it should be The World this afternoon. It is the 4th of January on the early evening or late afternoon of a foul day in perfidious Albion in the early part of 2024, and it is just before 5 p.m. in the evening. We are live on YouTube and Odyssey and Rumble. Links have been included in various different places. We will begin, as is customary, by greeting those who are in the chat, in the YouTube in particular. So, Jay, good morning to you over there in Norfolk, Virginia. President Jesus, who's listening whilst walking the dog. And Rob and Beans, good afternoon to both of you. Carmo, good afternoon. And Peter, who's also in a cold and wet perfidious Albion. Yuan, all the way over there in Phoenix, Arizona, who's enjoying the choice of music for the introduction. Banana Bender, good evening to you down on the other side of the world. Tim Gray, who says hello and who is also another resident of the most perfidious kingdom in the world. And Irish Partisan, who joins us from Minsk, saying, a cold wind is blowing from the steppes, an ominous omen for 2024. Perhaps, but the cold winds of winter also bring with them the seeds of regrowth. And I think that's always something we need to bear in mind. The list continues. Good afternoon to Lee. And my comrade Jason joins us from the Class Consciousness Project, who's joining live from Essex whilst doing the ironing. So, dramatic stuff. And I don't know how... Jason, I don't know if the darts have finished yet, but apparently it was disappointing. So people who watched it told me. Not Enough Manus has just found the program. Great show. Apparently based in the US. Well, glad you found us. Be sure to like and share and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Ben, my comrade up in Scotland, good afternoon to you. And Jerry, good afternoon to you. Okay, so 2 programs today because there's 2 different issues that need to be treated separately. There's the first one, which we're in now, which is going to be mostly about the speech given yesterday by Hasan Nasrallah and connected events. Hasan Nasrallah, the General Secretary of Hezbollah, spoke yesterday for around about an hour and 40 minutes. It wasn't particularly revelatory, but it's noteworthy, so I'll be going into that. Later on, we'll be going into the war in Ukraine and what the latest that's happening there. So we begin, though, by taking a look at the speech by Nasrallah. Now, the first thing to say is, of course, that this was postponed for a day after the assassination of a senior Hamas leader who was based in Beirut. The Israelis assassinated him via a drone strike on a residential area of Beirut. So, showing their typical regard for human life there, but there you go. And this speech was therefore even more greatly anticipated. But within it, Nasrallah didn't give any indication of a change in tactics. He didn't give any indication that there was going to be some sort of dramatic shift in the approach taken by Hezbollah. And there's very specific reasons for that. Now, in our earlier programs last year, when we were covering the speeches of Nasrallah, I commented that what he is essentially doing, along with the other forces in the resistance axis in the region of West Asia, called by the British and the US the Middle East, what they are doing is following a version of the tactics outlined by Chairman Mao in his famous text on Protracted War, the reference to which I've just put into the various different chats, so you can check it out if you want to, and I would recommend reading it. It's a very interesting and enlightening document. So Nasrallah in this speech again outlined the doctrines that they are following. I think he probably had to change his speech after the assassination of al-Awruri in Beirut and the bombing of the memorial to, or around the memorial in Iran to General Qasem Soleimani, which killed reportedly around about 100 people. So Nasrallah had to change, I think, the content of the speech and slightly, and talk essentially justifying the course of action that Hezbollah and others are taking. And in this, he repeated a lot of what he said from earlier speeches, particularly towards the end of last year. But essentially, what he is saying in this particular speech is that the strategy of the resistance forces in the Middle East are following an outline of a plan drawn up by the assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, who, of course, coordinated the fight against U.S. imperialism, because in Syria for many years, because it was U.S. imperialism they were always fighting. The forces of Hezbollah, the Syrian armed forces, the representatives of the IRGC in Syria, the Iranian forces that were fighting there, and all the other forces that were on the side of the Syrian government against the US imperialist coalition there. They were all fighting the forces of US imperialism. Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra or whatever their brand name is in Syria are a US imperialist force. The Kurdish forces in the north are a force of US imperialism. Their leaders have sold them to US imperialism, unfortunately. And that will do the Kurdish cause no good, even in the short term. It's certainly even worse in the long term. And also ISIS in Syria or Iraq or Iran must be regarded as a US-created entity. And John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, testified that they were more than prepared to have ISIS assume power in Syria. Now, they didn't want ISIS to take power in Iraq because that would make it too powerful. A proxy cannot be allowed to become too powerful. It must be, of course, kept in its box. And so for the US imperialists, the reason why they lent their air force to the popular mobilization units in Iraq and their campaign against ISIS was because that if ISIS had taken Baghdad, which they might have been able to do, it's doubtful whether they would have been able to hold it, but if that had occurred, it would have made ISIS far too strong in the region, and it would have been a severe propaganda blow to US imperialism. ISIS was meant to be a tool to be wielded against Assad, and it wasn't meant to take over whole areas of Iraq as well. It's meant to be kept in its box. And you'll notice that the two of the most silent groups you will find in the Middle East today are the groups who were aligned with US imperialism in Syria. So that's ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who have essentially said absolutely nothing about the war in Gaza. Nothing at all. Even some of the Chechen Ichkarians who are fighting for Ukraine said more about the Gaza war than the supposed great Muslim liberators in ISIS did, because ISIS is a proxy of US imperialism. It doesn't matter that they fought each other for a while in Iraq. They are still overwhelmingly on the same side and serving, and ISIS serves their interests in Syria. So this is a lesson, of course, that the US took from the British. The British had plenty of proxies that they would periodically betray, periodically they would fight with them, but then they would come back on side again. You always look at the actions of the British in the occupied 6 counties of Ireland if you want to get an indication as to how the British behave and plan their colonial campaigns. They will periodically, or this is true back in the time of the active phase of the Irish Liberation War, back 30, 40 years ago, they would routinely lock up and sometimes even kill loyalist paramilitary forces, but they still had the the allegiance of the loyalist paramilitary forces, and that remains the case to this day for all the clashes that take place periodically between the two. On a bigger scale, the same is true of ISIS. Sometimes ISIS's leaders get killed. Sometimes, allegedly, a US president will commission one of them to be offed. But they're still a US proxy. And these are things that need to be kept in mind. So Nasrallah's talking about, in his speech, because of the bombing of the memorial to Soleimani and the killing of 100 or so Iranians in this terrorist act in Iran, he talked about Soleimani and he talked about the tactics that they're following. And what he's talking about is the plans that General Soleimani drew up back in 2018 and 2019, immediately before his assassination in early 2020. Remember, that was 4 years ago now. Seems only 5 minutes ago. But the crucial thing to bear in mind is that Soleimani was working off a similar understanding of war to that which Chairman Mao had and expressed in his work. It's a different kind of war. It's not a peasant guerrilla war, but it is a protracted war. And as Mao analyzes in his work, you go between different phases in this war. And the war is an extension, of course, of a political struggle. And so for Soleimani, the struggle would often be non-military, and then it would cross over back into being a military struggle, often in the form of asymmetric warfare, which, of course, means that it is fought using means which are wildly different to what you might regard as a typical war. So like the war in Ukraine, for instance, is not asymmetric warfare. It is a conventional war in many respects. The Russians have, of course, the overwhelming advantage there, as we will talk about later this evening. But that is a war between two conventional armies with hundreds of field artillery pieces on each side, thousands of men lined up in trenches, many, many thousands of drones, etc. That's a conventional, full-blown war. Now, the war between the resistance forces and U.S. imperialism, and again, Nasrallah always emphasizes that the U.S. is the target, Israel is only the tool of the main target in all of his speeches. The war between the resistance forces and the U.S., sometimes it's a war on an asymmetric basis, meaning that the forces and the tactics used are between the different sides are wildly different. And sometimes the war enters into the realm of political struggle, but it's still a liberation process designed in the end to end the state of Israel, but only as part of a drive to remove U.S. imperialism from the region as a whole. And Nasrallah re-emphasized this point because the fronts that opened up during the lifetime of Soleimani himself are, of course, Syria, which we've already discussed, Iraq, which Nasrallah mentioned in his speech. He mentioned the role played by Soleimani and the Iranian forces in Iraq after 2003, when the insurgency against U.S. occupation forces began. And this, of course, was heavily influenced by Iran, who came to have a degree of control, or I should say more accurately, influence over the popular mobilization units. And we should remember that it was the Iranian-trained popular mobilization units that actually defeated ISIS. It wasn't the Iraqi army, which was trained at enormous expense and equipped at enormous expense by the US imperialists. That collapsed when it came up against ISIS, and it collapsed in a matter of, I think, less than a couple of weeks. Hundreds of thousands of men turned round and ran away. The commanders fled with bags of cash, because what was the Iraqi army actually for? It wasn't for fighting anybody. It was designed purely to be a tool of internal repression. And to actually fight anybody, particularly a reactionary, vicious force like ISIS, then you needed a different kind of organization. And the Iranians, with Soleimani playing the leading role, organized the popular mobilization units in Iraq and deployed those in such a way as to grind down ISIS, defeat it, and drive it out of Iraq. They are still there in Syria, sustained by the US imperialists and the Israelis, their proxies, of course. So these fronts that we're talking about here, as I've said, include Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, the liberation process of which Nasrallah was quite clear. He's quite clear in all the speeches that he gives, is still not completed until the Shebar farms have been returned to Lebanon, which is still occupied by the Israelis. But also, I think what Nasrallah and the other Hezbollah leaders are referring to when they're talking about Lebanon is also the need to complete the national liberation process in Lebanon, because the way in which the Lebanese state was allowed to emerge from the long period of civil war in the early 1990s meant that there was a lot of weaknesses baked into it. There was, of course, it's a sectarian constitution. It seeks to divide Lebanese politics up in a sectarian fashion. Again, this is the classic playbook of the British and the US imperialists, try and institutionalize religious and ethnic division in order to make sure that the state remains weak, and you can then choose a faction which you keep under your control, and then you seek to put that faction in charge of the whole state. This is what the French did with the Christians in Lebanon. It's what the US has taken up as well. And of course, the weakness of the Lebanese state, its indebtedness to the financial institutions of US imperialism, and the domination of the command of the Lebanese army by French and American stooges, basically, mean that the liberation process in Lebanon is, of course, not complete. Then you also have obviously the fulcrum of all of this, which is going on at the moment, and that is in Gaza. But you also have a site of struggle on the West Bank. And, of course, you have Yemen. So Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, and Yemen are the 6 fronts of the regional, let's call it a region-wide liberation struggle. And Hasan Nasrallah's point in raising all of this is, of course, he's talking about the way that the Soleimani designed this, which was, it was designed not to go into a full-blown confrontation with the US imperialists all at once. It was designed to essentially be a protracted war that would stretch the forces of US imperialism out and stretch them in ways that expose their weaknesses. And Hasan Nasrallah is very precise in his wording when he's talking about this. The purpose of exposing US imperialism and the purpose of showing its weaknesses and its inability to defend even its most powerful proxy in the region, in the form of Israel, is all about not only the process of militarily defeating imperialism, though that, of course, is important, but Nasrallah, when talking about his tactics as the leader of Hezbollah and Soleimani's tactics, it's also designed to destroy the prestige and the image of US imperialism, particularly in the region, but also globally. And he's quite clear and correct about this. The prestige of US imperialism, I mean, it might not be obvious to us. As communists, we're looking at it and seeing it as a blood-soaked, brutal, reactionary system that rampages around the world, killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in order to preserve the profits of US financialized capitalism. But, of course, Nasrallah and others in the region, such as Ansarullah, they are looking to influence the masses of the region. The job of Hezbollah as the leaders of the Lebanese National Liberation Movement is, of course, to mobilize. They principally mobilize amongst the poorer end of the Shia Muslim population in Lebanon, but also, and again, Nasrallah has talked about this on many occasions, they now aspire to leadership that transcends the sectarian divide in Lebanon. So now they, as a principally Lebanese Shia party and military organization, are now attracting many volunteers from the Sunni Muslim areas of Lebanon, because, of course, their aim, and indeed the aim of Soleimani and the more radical elements in the Iranian Islamic Republic, their aim has been to quash the sectarian divisions in the Middle East, firstly between the different branches of Islam. And again, Nasrallah has talked about this and was talking about this yesterday. The aim is to overcome the Sunni Shia division, because the Hezbollah are quite clear on it. This is something which has been designed by imperialism, by British imperialism, French imperialism, and US imperialism. Now, I would ask comrades to bear in mind when examining this, think of how the bourgeois press in America or in Britain, or no matter where you were, Australia, anywhere in the NATO bloc, shall we say, and its allies, think of how they portray political developments in the Middle East, certainly over the last 30 years, certainly since the end of the Soviet Union. What it's always portrayed as, and this is quite deliberate, is that what you have is these different groups of madmen, these irrational forces in the Middle East, and even the term Middle East is, of course, an imperialist term, but I'll use it to demonstrate the point I'm making. That what you get on BBC or ITN or Sky or CNN or in the New York Times, if you're a more intellectual, more aspiring intellectual bourgeois, is that they will say that there is an incurable division between the Sunni and the Shia, and between the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews, and this is what is driving all these conflicts in the Middle East. And you got this even from nominal opponents of the Iraq War as well. I remember 20 years ago now, longer, almost 21 years ago, early 2003, late 2002, before the war started, you got a lot of liberals in the United States and Britain saying, well, if we get rid of the Saddam regime, it'll unleash all these sectarian divisions that exist there, and it'll kill thousands because these people are all just irrational and insane. Now, of course, any serious research into Iraqi history reveals that that's not the case. What unleashed sectarianism, and it was done quite deliberately in Iraq, was the fostering of and the unleashing of sectarian forces, mainly those of the Sunni population, organized by US imperialism, with their leading representative being a man by the name of John Negroponte. Now, American comrades may be familiar with his work, but he was key to organizing death squads in Nicaragua, reactionary death squads in Nicaragua in the 80s. And he did the same thing in Iraq in the 2000s. The aim of it was to destroy the unified resistance against US imperialism by whipping up and fostering violent sectarian groups in the Sunni population that would destroy a unified resistance and create a bloody civil war in Iraq, in order then that US imperialism could stick itself in the middle and say, well, without us, the civil war will get worse. Our occupation must continue. Again, this is the same thing that the British did in India, for instance. The reason why there's several different states on the territory of old British India now is because, at least when it comes to Pakistan and India, or formerly East and West Pakistan and India, is because, of course, the British deliberately fostered the creation of religious sectarianism on both sides of the Hindu-Muslim religious divide. There's evidence in the British National Archives of how big a role the British played in the promotion of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League, and the creation of Pakistan was something that was warmly endorsed by Churchill and other arch-imperialists as a means of keeping a British military bootprint in the region. And that, of course, is a role that's now been taken on by US imperialism. But originally it was the British who were aiming to create Pakistan as a essentially a military outpost for Britain to retain influence within the region. And they also were, of course, influential in the growth of the the organization that was to become the BJP and the RSS, the Hindutva movement. Again, all designed to create or whip up religious sectarianism in order to weaken any states that emerged. And again, this is the same tactic that they applied in Iraq when they got into trouble. Destroy the unified resistance by leaning on the divisions that do exist, but were nowhere near what the liberals in the West said they were, to create a mass slaughter and then say, oh, well, we've got to stay to stabilize the situation. So it's been a priority of the Iranians for a long time now and Hezbollah to overcome those divisions that are deliberately fostered by imperialism, and of course to unify as far as they can all the forces in favor of Lebanese national liberation, including the Christian forces. And there's a number of Christians that have fought and died with the forces associated with Hezbollah. So it's becoming, and it aims to become, an umbrella national liberation movement. Yes, with a Shia Muslim core, but appealing to the Lebanese as Lebanese. And of course, quite deliberately, Nasrallah began his speech by wishing the Christian communities in the Middle East a Merry Christmas, and of course by referencing the fact that the birth of Christ is something which is sacred in the Christian religion, but also in Islam as well. And so this is clearly the line that they have decided upon as a response to the tactics of imperialism. And this is, of course, proving to be quite effective in terms of the prestige of Hezbollah actually growing, and has grown exponentially since the early 2000s, when they successfully drove the Israelis out of South Lebanon, then 6 years later when they beat the Israelis when they attempted an invasion. So, to go back to the question here, Soleimani clearly understood all of this and was working to create unified resistance movements that would incorporate all of the different religious groups in these countries in order to bring about a genuine national liberation movement. This has been done, of course, very successfully by Ansar Allah in Yemen, where, yes, the movement started by the Al-Houthi did start as a religious nationalistic movement that was predominantly based in South Yemen originally, but came to be a unifying national liberation army and political movement that incorporates within it various forms of religious, Shia religious nationalism, but that was not amplified, that was sublimated within the wider and growing Yemeni national movement, which includes secular nationalists, it includes Marxist-Leninists now quite extensively. Of course, there's a long history in both what had been North and especially South Yemen of communist organizations. And the new versions of these, the communist parties and Marxist organizations that existed in Yemen after unification, came to swing behind Ansar Allah as the leaders of the Yemeni national liberation movement. And so this tactic of bringing together all of the different forces that opposed US imperialism in the Middle East has been successful in Yemen, and it's being successful in Lebanon, and it's been successful in Gaza. Because, again, what have we seen in Gaza since October the 7th and before it? You saw, again, the long process of unification going on, starting in the prison system of Israel itself, with the debates that were had about unity between the different groups fighting for Palestinian liberation. So you got a long process of negotiation followed by a unity platform being agreed between Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Fatah even, who are of course aligned with Abbas somewhat, and others coming together to form the movement that carried out Al-Aqsa flood on October the 7th. So in Gaza and in Yemen and in Lebanon, you see the overcoming of the divisions deliberately amplified and stoked by imperialism, and the unification behind successful armies of national liberation, bringing together the Muslim religious nationalist forces, anti-colonial forces, and of course Marxist-Leninist forces, all unified around the approach to national liberation, around the need to wage these national liberation wars, and all of them putting aside or storing in, shall we say, putting the secondary contradictions to one side and focusing on the primary contradiction, which is the domination of the region and all the different countries within it by US imperialism. So the fact that Nasrallah went on at length about that shows how important the process of unification is and how successful they've been at it. I think that the big learning process for all of them came in, I think partly it came in Lebanon many years ago, because the movement led by Nasrallah came to prominence as a Shia movement aligned with Iran. But of course it grew in prestige as time went on, and they realized through the painful experiences of the Lebanese civil war that if they were ever going to get anywhere in terms of removing Israel from the map, but also removing US influence in Lebanon, then you needed to overcome the divisions deliberately institutionalized within the sectarian constitution. And Hezbollah has been looking to do that with differing degrees of success, I think it's fair to say. But the current war is, of course, amplifying that success. And, of course, the other thing to emphasize is that the assassination of Soleimani, authorized, lest we forget, by Donald Trump, and carried out enthusiastically by the likes of Pompeo and Bolton, came as part of a process of, shall we say, radicalization to an extent in the Islamic Republic of Iran itself. And what I mean by that is, of course, because the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was I would put it as a form of bourgeois nationalist revolution. The two-day party, the Iranian communists at the time, identified a national bourgeoisie as being in existence in Iran. And this national bourgeoisie actually did want to a certain extent, free Iran from the direct control of US imperialism. That its interests were being constricted by the regime of the Shah. And so it proved to be an accurate analysis. Unfortunately for the Tudeh party, the part of their analysis that they got wrong was how ruthless the Iranian bourgeois were prepared to be, which is, of course, they made an alliance with the Khomeinists and stamped out the Iranian communists for a generation. But because, of course, it was a national revolution, a nationalistic revolution. And it had, of course, an alliance between the Khomeinists as the political expression of it and the Iranian bourgeoisie. You have different tendencies within the Islamic Republic, and these have been on display for a long time. You have those who, perhaps represented by former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and certain more radical tendencies within the IRGC, that is still pursuing Khomeinism as a form of revolution. But you also have others within the Iranian state and within the Iranian ruling class who were determined to do some kind of deal with US imperialism and had been trying to pursue it for years. Like, to a certain extent, this was true of the presidency of Rouhani and others, and these so-called reformists who excited the West so very much because they thought that they would be able to essentially get the Iranians to give up on certain things. They thought that if they promoted the various different so-called reformist tendencies in Iran, that they would be able to get the Iranians to give up on supporting Palestinian liberation, to accept US domination of the region. And this proved not to be the case. So those tendencies were there, and the tendencies that supported normalization with the US imperialists were the ones who backed, of course, the JCPOA, the supposed agreement over the Iranian nuclear program. Now, Iran and certain elements in the ruling class in Iran wanted that agreement. They wanted to do a deal with US imperialism, and they wanted to normalize relations. What trashed it was, of course, the bull in a china shop approach of Trump, who trashed the JCPOA purely on the basis that it would get him a few votes in the Republican primary. He didn't have any strong beliefs in it or against it. What he knew was, though, that when he spoke against it, and it was something that the virulently reactionary and the most reactionary wing of the Republican Party in the United States was opposed to it, due to the fact that that wing is heavily influenced by pro-Israel sentiment, and the Israeli ruling clique were vehemently opposed to any normalization between US imperialism and Iran. For their own reasons, for their own very short-sighted reasons, as it turned out. Because much like everything that the US imperialists have done with regard to Russia, their tactics over Iran have proven to be disastrous. Because the US imperialists were split, as they are over many things in the ruling class, between a minority of them, probably represented by the Obama administration, who wanted not to just directly try and crush Iran and try and destroy the Islamic Republic, but to do this in a more subtle way. This was Obama's preference, and he tried the same approach with Cuba. The JCPOA and other agreements that the Obama was seeking to achieve with Iran, Biden's tried something similar as well, with the return of Iranian frozen assets to Iran, which of course led to immediately the screams of treason from the ultra-reactionaries, including Trump. They understand, or some of their intelligence men understand, that there are tendencies within Iran that could be enhanced, that could be worked with, in order to normalize relations between US imperialism and Iran to a certain extent, to allow US imperialism to do business again in Iran, and thus to weaken the hold of the more radical Khomeinists, the more radical nationalists in the Islamic Republic, and to promote so-called moderates by doing deals, by integrating Iran into US-dominated global financial and trade systems. Now, that was a reasonable bet. Unfortunately for the more sober US imperialists, the Trump regime crashed around the place and destroyed all of this at the behest of, and in order to carry out crude transactional politics with Sheldon Adelson, Trump turned his back on all of this, squashed the JCPOA, ramped up the sanctions, and assassinated Qasem Soleimani. So much like with the Putin administration in Russia, the Iranian moderates, those who might be persuaded to cooperate with U.S. imperialism, had the political ground under their feet completely cut away by the actions of Trump and now the actions of Biden. Because, of course, the U.S. imperialists pursue regime change in Iran one way or another. Some of the more belligerent of them favor some sort of military solution. They'll never get it. They won't beat Iran in a war. There's no way they can win. Some think that if they just do a bit of a bombing campaign, hit Tehran with some cruise missiles, that somehow the Islamic Republic will crumble. This, again, is a foolish notion, bred from a completely ignorant view of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because nut jobs like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and others view the Islamic Republic as just purely ruled by terror, they don't understand that there is between a fifth and a quarter of the Iranian population that enthusiastically support the system created by the Iranian Revolution, that enthusiastically support the system of the Islamic Republic to this day and are more than prepared to mobilize in vast numbers to defend it, sometimes literally in the form of the Basij militia, and also in terms of turning out for protests, turning up for these sort of symbolic things that happen in Iran where 250,000 people will turn up and sign a vow to go and fight Israel and stuff like that. So the Iranian Revolution that started in 1979 goes on and hasn't been completely subordinated to the whims of the Iranian capitalist class, because there is and remains a degree of not just popular support, but also a popular support that is prepared to mobilize in a militant fashion in its defense. And that's, of course, why, or a big part of the reason why, any color revolution in Iran isn't going to work. Because if you have between a fifth and a quarter of the population who are prepared to mobilize in defense of the existing system, then you don't get the kind of unstable, hollowed out regime that can be overthrown by a color revolution. When you've got the participation of the masses in some way, that's the best defense against color revolutions and against the kind of assumptions that John Bolton and others are making, which is, oh, well, if you just drop a few bombs on them, the whole thing will fall apart. It's incorrect. Even those who hate the Islamic Republic, who hate the Khomeinist system, will not rally to any of the comprador forces that the US has at its disposal. Even those who can't stand Khomeinism aren't going to welcome back the son of the old Shah. They're not going to welcome in some Zelensky-type figure, an Iranian Zelensky, or some other stooge who's come out of the West, or anybody who's even associated with the West. So this gamble that John Bolton and others now want the US to take of bombing Iran as an excuse, with an excuse that, well, we've got to bomb Iran to stop the attacks on Israel, this is just simply not going to work. And it would lead to a disaster for the US imperialists in the region, which is the reason why they're not doing it. Anyway, the point being that the Iranian Revolution continues, partially because of the failure of the US imperialists to approach, their inability to approach the Iranian leadership with proposals that would be acceptable not just to them, but to the Iranian masses regarding relations between the U.S. imperialists and Iran. So much like with the Putin group in Russia, you've had a radicalization process in Iran over the years, whereby those who have sought a bargain with the U.S. imperialists have found themselves more and more marginalized, because every time that these guys try and do a deal with the US imperialists, US imperialism promptly kicks any Iranian who tries to do a deal with them in the bollocks and laughs at them, and then plots to overthrow the government again. So what the Iranians have had to go through is a long, painful process of learning, as has, by the way, the Syrian government, headed by now Bashar al-Assad, who in the past, and this is true of his father Hafez al-Assad as well, had some very dubious relationships with the US imperialists themselves. Yes, the US imperialists wanted rid of Assad, but they'd collaborated with him in the recent past. And Assad had hoped, via the War on Terror years, to reach some kind of accommodation with US imperialism, as, by the way, Gaddafi hoped to as well, and only goes to show how wrong you can be about that. But what the Syrian war and the other things that US imperialism was up to in the region finally did was it made all of these regional actors horribly aware, finally, that there was no possibility of ever getting some kind of deal with US imperialism. So when Hasan Nasrallah says, well, now we are in a war to drive them out, that's what he means, exactly what he says, because he speaks from many decades of experience of, behind the scenes at least, dealing with the US imperialists. And he and the Iranian leadership have come to the conclusion that you just simply can't deal with them. That the only thing you can try and do is to defeat them militarily and politically and drive them out of the region, which is what, of course, the protracted war strategy that Nasrallah is talking about aims to do. So what they aim to do is stretch US imperialism itself. And as I was saying earlier, this is about showing to the masses in the Middle East that the imperial state, the imperialist nation, US imperialism, is not some kind of unbeatable colossus, that this is, again, to go and use Mao's phrase, it is a paper tiger. What the Iranians and what the Lebanese and the Palestinians and the Yemenis are doing is revealing how true Mao's old dictum is, which is that US imperialism is a paper tiger. It cannot even combat adequately the Yemenis in the Red Sea. Yes, it killed a few of them the other day in an exchange of fire in the Red Sea, but the Yemenis keep on shutting down the port of Eilat in Israel, and they keep disrupting the shipping lanes in the Red Sea to the point where all the major shipping firms are now seeking alternative routes, or most of them are anyway. So what they are seeking to prove in the eyes of the masses across the Middle East is just how impotent US imperialism is, just how much of a brutish impotence Israel displays, that they can't beat the unified and determined masses in Yemen, that they have been unable to beat them in Syria, and then they are now on the verge of being driven out of Iraq. So this is, again, there is a large element of demonstrating to all the different elements in the Middle East, not only that a nationalist-inspired unity is the best way to overcome the problems of their countries, but also that the colossus that has portrayed itself as immortal for so long is not only distinctly mortal, but is decaying and is unable to deal with quite basic things. And Nasrallah was saying that this is essentially what they want to do, and this is behind the tactics that they are using. And the aim, as I said, is to stretch the resources of US imperialism to the breaking point. And that means maintaining the current level of hostilities at a certain rate. And that means being able to escalate and tie down Israeli forces in the north of occupied Palestine, which is what's going on at the moment, to be able to expose the US forces as being unable to do anything about the Iraqi and Syrian missiles hitting their bases, that they're unable to do anything about the Yemeni strikes in the Red Sea, that they're unable, the Israelis that is, to meet and obtain any of their objectives when it comes to the assault on Gaza, which is leading to an awful lot of death, not just, I mean, obviously of the Palestinians themselves, but an awful lot of death and destruction of the Israeli army, to the point where the Israeli army is starting to crack up under the strain of it all, which is why you're getting so many displays of blatant criminality. I mean, we've talked before about how much, to draw on the work of Frantz Fanon, the imperialist powers seek to obtain dramatic demonstrations of their superiority whenever the resistance forces have inflicted a defeat on them. All these TikTok videos, these sort of like war crime TikTok videos that the Israelis keep doing and incriminating themselves, it's all because they are losing and losing badly in Gaza. They're killing, yes, a lot of Palestinians, but again, the resistance forces, the National Liberation Forces, appear to, and the masses who support them, appear to have an understanding of how this is going to go that goes far beyond the level of watery pacifism you get in the Western left, even those who are better on the issue of Gaza than on most other things. You still get this pacifist knee-jerk response, which needs to be compared to how the locals see it, how the Palestinians see it, who are, if not willing to sacrifice themselves for liberation later, then they are fully understanding those that do. And this is the question that the US cannot possibly address. The fact that not only are people willing to die in large numbers to free their land, but also that this, again, has a great deal of popular support. Whereas, of course, the connection between the Israeli regime and even the Israeli settler classes is becoming weaker and weaker, which is why, of course, you get like Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, warning that Israel might collapse. It's not just an attempt at blackmail, it's a recognition of something that's real. So Nasrallah is making it clear with it that they are going to continue with the tactics that exist at the moment, stretching the Israeli forces by engaging them repeatedly on the northern flank, and being able to keep up that level of activity to tie down large numbers of Israeli forces that otherwise would be deployed in full to Gaza. And you, of course, have the escalating situation in the West Bank, where the forces of Abbas are becoming more and more isolated, where the National Liberation Forces are growing in strength. And eventually it's widely acknowledged that the forces of Abbas are going to fall apart. Or a lot of them are already said to have been defecting to the National Liberation Forces and away from Fatah. Excuse me. So this is where things stand at the moment. It's another very interesting contribution from the Hezbollah leadership. It's clear that they intend to continue the methods of fighting that they've been engaging in so far. The idea being that the Israeli forces and the US imperialists and their allies and vassals find themselves more and more stretched over in terms of their commitments in the region. Their weakness is exposed, and that this is used to build support for national liberation movements all the way across the Middle East, as more of the masses see just how weak and just how impotent US imperialism is more of the masses will step forward wanting to play their part in driving it out. And of course, it'll break the spell that exists within many people's minds over the allegedly powerful nature of US imperialism and how it portrays itself as unbeatable. And so then, once the defeat has become clear, it'll become unstoppable. That is, the momentum that will be behind the resistance forces in ridding the Middle East or West Asia of the US and British and Israeli occupations that have plagued it since the 1940s. So, very interesting speech by Nasrallah, clearly influenced by a lot of Marxist-Leninist theory on protracted war as expressed best by Mao, and clearly an indication that the level of struggle that is going on at the moment will continue until liberation is reached. So I will leave my comments in this first program of the day there. Please be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already. And the other program will be out at 11 p.m. today. Now I'll just pause to pick up a question. Ben says Scottish nationalism comes to mind. Well, that's of course true. Scottish nationalism in Britain is a political project of the bourgeoisie. It's designed to soak up opposition in Scotland and take it in a completely fruitless direction. Yes, and Happy New Year to Dan Kovalik, who's joined us. Welcome, Dan. Hope you're enjoying the program. So, I'll be back at 11 p.m. tonight with an update on the Russia-NATO war. And until then, I'll say thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope that you've gained something from this discussion. And I will be back with you again later on. Now I'm going to throw you back over to a musical interlude.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up there.